The Garden of Secrets. Rose Delaney arrived at Sunset Gardens like a storm wrapped in Chanel, and I knew she was going to ruin everything. At 72, I had ruled this exclusive retirement community for 5 years. I prided myself on reading people instantly, and this woman screamed danger. She stepped out of her black town car with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Rose was stunning in that effortless way that only comes with serious money. Silver hair and a perfect chignon, designer clothes, and jewelry that could fund a small country. The diamond tennis bracelet alone was worth more than most people's cars. I watched from my strategic position in the lobby as she charmed Timothy, our young concierge, into stammering submission. Her voice carried just enough Southern charm to suggest old Charleston money, but something felt rehearsed about her performance. Margaret Wilson, my closest ally and former Emory librarian, raised an eyebrow at my obvious interest. Margaret had a talent for spotting trouble, and she was already cataloging Rose's every move. Rose's apartment was in the premium North Wing, the kind of suite that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. Only the seriously wealthy could afford those views of our manicured gardens and private lake. The welcome cocktail party I organized for Friday evening was when Rose truly showed her hand. She arrived fashionably late in a midnight blue dress, accessorized with what was clearly a museum-quality sapphire necklace. Every man in the room turned to stare, including Frank Sterling. Frank was my secret obsession, a distinguished 74-year-old retired federal judge who had been widowed for 8 years. I had been carefully positioning myself as the obvious choice for his affections for 2 years. But watching his face as Rose entered the room, I felt my plans crumble. The way Frank looked at Rose was electric, nothing like the polite interest he had shown me. Rose worked the room like a professional, charming each group with practiced ease. She had all the right stories about European travel, the perfect balance of vulnerability and sophistication. When she reached our corner, Margaret was ready with probing questions. Rose deflected them beautifully. Yes. She was recently widowed. Her husband had been an import-export. They had lived in Charleston and Savannah. All perfectly reasonable, all completely vague. Frank joined our conversation just as Rose mentioned her late husband's love of golf. Within minutes, he was offering to show her our course the next morning. I watched my romantic dreams walk away arm in arm with a woman who had been here for exactly 5 days. Over the next 3 weeks, Rose's conquest of Sunset Gardens was swift and brutal. She joined every activity, volunteered for committees, and made herself indispensable. But it was her relationship with Frank that truly twisted the knife. They took daily walks, attended events together, and Frank was visibly happier than he had been in years. The man who had barely noticed me for 24 months was now completely infatuated with our mysterious newcomer. But I wasn't the only one suspicious of Rose's rapid ascent. Beatrice Hartwell, the sharp-tongued widow who lived in the penthouse, had begun making subtle comments about Rose's story not adding up. Harold Mackenzie, our resident retired banker, mentioned that Rose's financial arrangements were unusual. She had paid a full year in advance through a trust that seemed unnecessarily complex. The first real crack in Rose's facade appeared during the bridge tournament. She was partnered with Eleanor Vasquez, a former diplomat who spoke 7 languages. When Eleanor made a comment in French about their strategy, Rose responded fluently without thinking, then caught herself and pretended she hadn't understood. Eleanor later pulled me aside and whispered that Rose's French was excellent. Too excellent for someone who claimed to have only studied it in college. Her accent was perfect, suggesting years of immersion rather than academic study. I filed this information away, but it was Margaret who made the next disturbing discovery. She had been researching Rose's background for what she claimed was a new resident profile for the newsletter. But her searches for Rose Delaney in Charleston and Savannah society pages had turned up nothing significant. For someone who claimed to have been socially active for decades, Rose had left remarkably few traces. No charity board memberships, no mentions in wedding announcements or obituaries of family members, no photographs from fundraising galas. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air. A Halloween party was my last stand. I had commissioned a historically accurate Marie Antoinette costume that cost $2,000. I was going to reclaim my position as Queen of Sunset Gardens. Instead, Rose appeared as Cleopatra in an authentic vintage costume worth more than my car. The Egyptian silk, the genuine ancient jewelry, the flawless makeup. She looked like she had stepped out of a museum. Frank, dressed as Mark Antony, was so obviously smitten, it was painful to watch. They won the couples contest unanimously, and their acceptance speech was pure theater that had everyone eating out of their hands. But during the party, something happened that would change everything. Dr. Patricia Clemens, our resident physician who had moved to Sunset Gardens after retiring from Emory Hospital, struck up a conversation with Rose about medical matters. Patricia mentioned a rare surgical procedure that had been pioneered at Johns Hopkins, and Rose responded with detailed knowledge that went far beyond what a layperson should know. When Patricia pressed for more information, Rose quickly deflected, claiming her late husband had undergone the procedure. But Patricia later told me that Rose's knowledge was too specific, too current. She suspected Rose had medical training, significant medical training that she was hiding. That night, I made the decision that would unravel everything. I called Harrison Blackwood, the private investigator I had used when I suspected Charles of cheating. If Rose wanted to play games, I was going to find out exactly who I was dealing with. Harrison was expensive, but thorough. I gave him Rose's basic information and told him to dig deep. I also mentioned the inconsistencies others had noticed: the perfect French, the medical knowledge, the lack of social footprint. While waiting for Harrison's report, I began my own investigation. I enlisted Margaret's help, and we started paying closer attention to Rose's habits and behaviors. We noticed that she received very little mail, and what she did receive was addressed to a post office box rather than her previous home address. Mentioned to Margaret that Rose's apartment had very few personal belongings for someone who claimed to have lived in large homes for decades. Most residents moved to Sunset Gardens with family photographs, books, china, and other treasures accumulated over a lifetime. Rose's apartment contained beautiful furniture and artwork, but nothing personal. No family photos, no books with personal inscriptions, no objects that suggested a life lived anywhere else. It was as if she had furnished her entire apartment from an expensive catalog. I got my chance to investigate further when Rose mentioned a jammed bedroom window. I volunteered to take a look, and she reluctantly agreed. Her apartment was beautifully appointed, but strangely impersonal, like an expensive hotel suite rather than a home. The only personal touch was a framed photograph on her nightstand, which she quickly turned face down when she noticed my interest. Too painful to look at Thomas, so soon after his death, she explained. But I had glimpsed enough to know it wasn't a recent photo. The clothing and hairstyles were at least 30 years old. In her walk-in closet, I noticed something odd. Rose had expensive clothes, but not many of them, and several still had tags attached. For someone who claimed to have been socially active for decades, she had surprisingly few formal gowns or pieces with obvious sentimental value. More disturbing was what I found in her bathroom medicine cabinet when I was supposedly checking the window mechanism. Rose had a collection of prescription bottles, but the names on the labels were different. Some said Rose Delaney, others said Rose Delacroix, and one said simply R. Delacroix. I memorized the names and later asked Margaret to research them. Rose Delacroix had been arrested in Miami 5 years ago for prescription fraud, but the charges had been dropped. R. Delacroix had been mentioned in a New Orleans newspaper article about a murder investigation. As the widow of the victim, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but I needed Harrison's professional investigation to confirm my suspicions. His report arrived 3 weeks later, and he insisted on meeting in person. We met at a downtown cafe, and his grim expression told me everything before he opened his mouth. Rose Delaney was a lie. There had been a Rose Delaney married to Thomas Delaney in Charleston, but she had died in a car accident 20 years ago. The woman charming her way through Sunset Gardens was actually Rosa Delacroix from New Orleans, a sophisticated con artist who specialized in targeting wealthy retirement communities. But her story was even more complex than simple fraud. Rosa had been married to Antoine Delacroix, a wealthy businessman who had been murdered in their New Orleans mansion 15 years ago. The murder had never been solved, but police suspected it was connected to Antoine's involvement in money laundering for organized crime. Rosa had been the prime suspect initially, but her alibi was solid. She had been at a charity gala with 300 witnesses. After Antoine's death, she had inherited his estate, but most of it had been frozen by federal investigators looking into his financial dealings. That's when Rosa had turned to crime. She had adopted the identity of the deceased Rose Delaney and begun targeting wealthy retirement communities. Her method was always the same: arrive with impeccable credentials, charm her way into the community, identify the wealthiest and most vulnerable residents, and then disappear with their money. Harrison showed me evidence of at least 5 previous schemes in communities across the Southeast. She had stolen over $2 million from elderly victims, always careful to take amounts that wouldn't trigger major investigations, and targeting people who were too proud or embarrassed to report the crimes. The most chilling part was how she selected her victims: lonely widows and widowers with substantial assets and no close family. People exactly like Frank Sterling. But Harrison had uncovered something even more disturbing. Rosa hadn't just been Antoine's wife. She had been his partner in crime. The innocent victim story was another lie. She had been involved in his money laundering operation and had likely arranged his murder, when she discovered he was planning to disappear with all their money. The New Orleans police had never been able to prove her involvement, but they were convinced she had killed her husband and made it look like a mob hit. Rosa Delacroix wasn't just a con artist, she was potentially a murderer. Harrison warned me that confronting Rosa directly could be extremely dangerous. She had proven capable of violence when cornered, and people in her line of work didn't hesitate to eliminate threats. He strongly recommended that I contact the FBI immediately, but I couldn't let her destroy Frank without giving him a chance to protect himself. I also knew that if I went to the authorities immediately, the investigation would become public and Frank would be humiliated in front of the entire community. I made a decision that would haunt me for months. I would confront Rosa myself, but I would be prepared for the consequences. I chose my moment carefully. Frank was in Atlanta for a doctor's appointment, and most of the other residents were at the weekly movie screening. I knocked on Rosa's door with Harrison's evidence folder in hand, but I also had my cell phone ready to call 911 if necessary. Rosa took one look at my face and knew the game was up. Without her carefully constructed public persona, she looked harder, more dangerous, but she stepped aside and let me in, closing the door behind me. The transformation was immediate and chilling. The sweet, vulnerable widow disappeared, replaced by someone calculating and cold. Rosa poured herself a glass of wine and sat down across from me. Her entire demeanor changed. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I opened the folder and showed her the photographs from New Orleans, the documentation of her previous cons, the evidence of her real identity. Rosa didn't deny anything. Instead, she surprised me by laughing, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Then she told me the truth, and it was worse than anything I had imagined. She had indeed been married to Antoine Delacroix, but not as an innocent victim. She had been his full partner in the money laundering operation, using her charm and social connections to facilitate their criminal activities. They had been laundering money for some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, but Antoine had become greedy and paranoid. He had begun skimming money from their clients and making plans to disappear with their entire fortune. Rosa had discovered his betrayal and realized that when their clients found out, they would kill both of them. So she had killed Antoine first. The charity gala alibi had been carefully constructed. Rosa had hired a professional killer to murder Antoine while she was surrounded by witnesses. The crime scene had been staged to look like a mob hit, and the investigation had focused on Antoine's criminal associates rather than his grieving widow. After Antoine's death, Rosa had stolen what money she could before the federal investigators froze the accounts. But it hadn't been enough to maintain her lifestyle, so she had turned to targeting retirement communities. Her method was more sophisticated than simple theft. She would identify wealthy residents, gain their trust, and then convince them to invest in fake business opportunities or lend her money for fabricated emergencies. By the time her victims realized they had been conned, she had disappeared with a new identity. The retirement community cons weren't just about money. They were about staying hidden from the dangerous people who would kill her if they ever discovered she was still alive. Rosa Delacroix had been officially dead for 10 years, and she intended to keep it that way. But Sunset Gardens was different, she claimed. She was tired of running, tired of lying, tired of looking over her shoulder. She had come here hoping to find peace and possibly a genuine relationship with someone like Frank. I stared at this woman who had seemed so elegant and refined, realizing I was sitting across from a murderer who had been planning to defraud the man I cared about. Rosa seemed to read my thoughts. She leaned forward and smiled, and for the first time, I saw the predator beneath the polished surface. She told me that she had no intention of leaving Sunset Gardens. She had found the perfect hiding place among people who were too polite to ask difficult questions and too trusting to suspect her real nature. Frank was going to be her final score. She planned to marry him, gain access to his substantial fortune, and then arrange for his death to look like natural causes. After all, she said with that cold smile, who would suspect a grieving widow in a retirement community? I felt my blood turn to ice. This wasn't just fraud. This was a murder plot. Rosa intended to kill Frank once she had gained access to his money. I told her I was going to the police immediately, but Rosa just laughed again. She pointed out that everything she had told me was hearsay. I had no proof of her confession, and she would simply deny everything if I tried to report it. More importantly, she had been very careful to establish her reputation as a sweet, vulnerable widow who was devoted to Frank. If I accused her of planning to murder him, who would believe me? The jealous woman who had been competing for Frank's attention, or the charming newcomer who had brought so much joy to his life? Rosa was right, and we both knew it. She had played her game too well, and now she held all the cards. But then she made a mistake that would change everything. Rosa reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph from her nightstand. She wanted to show me just how thoroughly she had researched her targets before coming to Sunset Gardens. The photograph showed a much younger Rosa with a man I recognized instantly, despite the 30 years that had passed. It was Charles, my Charles. Rosa had been my husband's mistress during the early years of our marriage. The affair had lasted nearly 3 years, and Rosa claimed that Charles had been completely infatuated with her. She had ended the relationship when she met Antoine, who had offered her more money and excitement than a small-town businessman could provide. She had kept the photograph all these years as a reminder of the power she had over men. When she learned about Charles's death and discovered that I was living at Sunset Gardens, she had decided to come here partly out of curiosity and partly for revenge. I had won Charles in the end, she said, but she was going to win Frank. And after Frank was dead, she might just reveal the truth about Charles's affair to destroy whatever good memories I had left. Rosa had made a fatal error. She had assumed that learning about Charles's betrayal would devastate me and make me more vulnerable to her manipulations. Instead, it filled me with a rage that burned away my fear. I stood up and told Rosa exactly what I thought of her and her plans. I didn't care if she denied everything. I was going to the FBI with Harrison's evidence and my own testimony. I would rather be seen as a jealous old woman than let her murder Frank. Rosa's composure finally cracked. She screamed at me that I was a fool, that I had no idea what I was interfering with. She had killed before, and she wouldn't hesitate to kill again if I tried to stop her. That threat was her second mistake. I had been recording our conversation on my phone from the moment she confessed to murdering Antoine. I had enough evidence to put her away for life, and now I had her threatening to kill me as well. Rosa realized what had happened when she saw my phone. For a moment, I thought she might try to attack me, but instead she made a different choice. She laughed and told me that it didn't matter. She was Rosa Delacroix, and Rosa Delacroix was supposed to be dead. even if I turned over the recording to the FBI, she would simply disappear again with another identity. But this time, she would make sure to eliminate any threats first. The next few hours were the most terrifying of my life. I left Rosa's apartment and immediately called Harrison, who contacted the FBI. But Rosa had vanished by the time the agents arrived. Her apartment was empty, and there was no trace of where she had gone. The FBI agents took my statement and Harrison's evidence, that they warned me that Rosa was extremely dangerous and likely to try to disappear permanently. They also told me that I might be in danger. Rosa had made specific threats against me, and she had a history of eliminating people who posed a threat to her freedom. Frank returned from Atlanta to find the retirement community in chaos. FBI agents were interviewing residents, and the local police had increased patrols around the property. When I told him the truth about Rosa, he was devastated. He had been completely fooled by her performance. The woman he had been falling in love with was a con artist and murderer who had been planning to kill him for his money. The betrayal was almost more than he could bear. But Frank's pain was nothing compared to what happened next. 2 days after Rosa's disappearance, Harold Mackenzie was found dead in his apartment. The death appeared to be natural, a heart attack brought on by his existing cardiac condition. But the FBI investigators found evidence that someone had been in his apartment, and Harold's safe had been opened. Harold had been Sunset Gardens' unofficial banker, managing investments for several residents and keeping emergency cash in his safe. Nearly $200,000 was missing. The FBI concluded that Rosa had returned to the community during the night, broken into Harold's apartment, and triggered his fatal heart attack while robbing him. She had gotten the money she needed to disappear permanently. Harold's death shattered the sense of security that had defined life at Sunset Gardens. Residents began questioning everyone and everything. Some moved out immediately, unable to cope with the idea that they had been living with a murderer. Frank blamed himself for Harold's death. If he hadn't been so easily fooled by Rosa's charms, if he hadn't been more suspicious of her story, Harold might still be alive. The guilt was eating him alive. I tried to comfort Frank, but I was dealing with my own trauma. Rosa's revelation about Charles had destroyed my faith in my marriage and my memories of our life together. Everything I had believed about our relationship had been built on lies. But worse than the betrayal was the fear. Rosa was still out there, and she had threatened to kill me if I interfered with her plans. The FBI had placed me under protection, but I knew that someone with Rosa's skills and resources could find me if she was determined enough. Margaret stayed close to me during those dark weeks, providing the support and friendship I desperately needed. She helped me process the shocking revelations about both Rosa and Charles, and she encouraged me to focus on healing rather than dwelling on the betrayals. 3 months after Rosa's disappearance, the FBI finally caught up with her. She had been arrested in Seattle while trying to con her way into another retirement community. The evidence from Sunset Gardens, combined with her previous crimes, was enough to ensure she would spend the rest of her life in prison. But the damage had been done. Harold was dead, Frank was broken, and the entire community had been traumatized by the realization that evil could hide behind the most charming facades. Frank never fully recovered from his encounter with Rosa. He became withdrawn and suspicious, unable to trust his own judgment about people. He refused all offers of companionship and spent most of his time alone in his apartment. I threw myself into helping the community heal from the trauma Rosa had inflicted. I organized counseling sessions, memorial services for Harold, and social activities designed to rebuild trust and connection among the residents. But I was struggling with my own healing. The revelation about Charles's affair had shattered my understanding of our marriage and my own judgment about the people I loved. How had I been so blind to his betrayal? How had I failed to see Rosa's true nature until it was almost too late? Margaret helped me understand that both Charles and Rosa had been skilled manipulators who had practiced their deceptions for years. My failure to see through their lies wasn't a reflection of my weakness or naivety. It was a testament to their skill at hiding their true selves. Gradually, I began to rebuild my life and my relationships. I reached out to family members I had neglected, including my niece Sarah, who provided new perspectives on Charles's character and our marriage. Through her, I learned that Charles had struggled with feelings of inadequacy and fear of commitment throughout his life. His affair with Rosa had been a symptom of those struggles, not a rejection of our marriage. He had loved me, but he had also been terrified of disappointing me and had sought validation from someone who seemed to demand nothing from him. The knowledge was painful, but liberating. I could finally see our marriage as it really was, imperfect but genuine, complicated but meaningful. Charles had made terrible choices, but he had also been a good man who had tried to do right by me in the end. As for Rosa, I learned from the FBI that she had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her crimes had finally caught up with her, and she would never again be able to prey on vulnerable people. But I also learned something that chilled me to the bone. Rosa had been planning to kill not just Frank, but me as well. The FBI had found detailed plans in her belongings, including information about my daily routines and the best ways to stage my death as an accident. I had been closer to death than I had realized, saved only by my decision to confront Rosa before she could complete her murderous plans. The knowledge that I had been marked for death was terrifying, but it also gave me a strange sense of empowerment. I had faced down a killer and survived. I had trusted my instincts and fought for the people I cared about, even when it put me in danger. A year after Rosa's arrest, life at Sunset Gardens had returned to something approaching normal. New residents had moved in, security had been increased, and the community had developed new protocols for screening applicants. Frank had begun to emerge from his isolation, though he remained changed by his experience. He had started attending community events again and had even begun speaking to other residents about his ordeal, helping them process their own trauma. I had settled into a new role as an unofficial counselor and support person for residents dealing with difficult situations. My experience with Rosa had taught me valuable lessons about trust, judgment, and the importance of looking beneath surface appearances. But most importantly, I had learned that it was possible to survive betrayal and trauma and emerge stronger on the other side. Rosa had tried to destroy me, but instead she had taught me resilience and the value of fighting for what mattered. The garden of secrets that had bloomed at Sunset Gardens during Rosa's brief stay had revealed uncomfortable truths about all of us. We had been too trusting, too eager to believe the best about people, too willing to accept charming facades at face value. But we had also learned that communities could heal from trauma, that people could support each other through the darkest times, and that evil could be defeated by ordinary people with the courage to stand up for what was right. Rosa Delacroix had come to Sunset Gardens as a predator, but she had left as something else entirely. A cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of staying vigilant against those who would exploit our vulnerabilities. In the end, we had all been changed by our encounter with evil. Some of us had been broken by it, others had been strengthened by it, but none of us would ever be quite the same. The most important lesson Rosa had taught us was that appearances could be deceiving, that evil could hide behind the most charming smile, and that the price of safety was eternal vigilance. But she had also taught us that love and friendship and community could survive even the most devastating betrayals, and that ordinary people could find the courage to fight back against those who would harm them. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I thought about the year that had changed everything. Rosa's arrival had been devastating, but it had also been necessary. She had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our community. And in the end, we had emerged stronger and wiser. The garden of secrets had bloomed and withered, but the lessons it had taught us would last forever. And that, perhaps, was the most valuable legacy of our encounter with the woman who had called herself Rose Delaney.